Hello, scholars. Welcome back to the Listen to Reading Center. It's been a while since we've done Listen to Reading, and some of you are maybe doing it for the first time because you've just joined us recently. I thought it would be nice for us to start Listen to Reading again since it seems to be something that you enjoyed, and because now that we're getting back into a novel, it's another way for you to be reading other books within the same genre along with me. In class, we are reading Matilda. And for Listen to Reading, we're going to be reading a book by the same author, Roald Dahl. This book that you'll listen to at Listen to Reading is called James and the Giant Peach. You may have heard of it because there was a movie that came out about James and the Giant Peach. We probably won't get through the whole book at least Listen to Reading Center, but we'll get you a good ways into it, and then you can finish it off on your own if you want to once the unit is over. So we're talking about the genre of fantasy. Now, fantasy is a made-up or fiction story. Now, historical fiction and realistic fiction were also made-up or fiction stories, but the difference between fantasy and those is that fantasy stories have characters and events that could not happen in real life. So when we talk about realistic fiction and we think of Maniac Magee, most of the things in Maniac Magee could happen in real life. Maniac could have been a real person. And when we think of historic fiction, like Watson's Go to Birmingham, we think about things that could have happened in the past. All of the things that happen in Watson's either did happen or could have happened in real life. When we get into fantasy, these are things that are made up, that are not real, and could not happen in our real lives. Take a second and copy down the definition of fantasy that's on this slide into your journal. You can pause the video and restart it when you're done copying. Okay, if the video is playing again, that means that you finished copying that slide and that you have the definition of fantasy written into your journal. I also wanted to go over what makes a fantasy. Most fantasy stories have magic, other worlds, magical creatures, or heroism, meaning that someone is the hero in a fantasy story. You can also add this to your list of definitions, or to your definition that you just wrote down. Pause the video if you need to. Here are a couple examples of other fantasy stories that you might know. Harry Potter. Harry Potter has magic, it has other worlds, it has magical creatures, and it has a lot of heroes in it. It also could not happen in real life. Same with series of unfortunate events and many of the fairy tales that we all know. Now getting to James and the Giant Peach. Right now we're talking about characters and narrators. Now Roald Dahl writes a lot of his books in the same style, so you might notice that this is kind of similar to Matilda. Just follow along, and at the end of the story, you'll have a quick assignment. Until he was 4 years old, James Henry Trotter had a happy life. He lived peacefully with his mother and father in a beautiful house beside the sea. There were always plenty of other children for him to play with, and there was always the sandy beach for him to run about on, and the ocean to paddle in. It was the perfect life for a small boy. Then one day, James's mother and father went into London to do some shopping. And there was a terrible thing happened. Both of them suddenly got eaten up in full daylight, mind you, and on a crowded street by an enormous, angry rhinoceros, which had escaped from the London Zoo. Now that reminds me of fantasy. That's not something that would happen in real life, that a giant rhinoceros would come and eat some people in the middle of a large city. Reading on. Now this, as you can well imagine, was a rather nasty experience for two such gentle parents, but in the long run, it was far nastier for James than it was for them. Their troubles were all over in a jiffy. They were dead and gone in 35 seconds flat. Poor James, on the other hand, was still very much alive. and all at once he found himself alone and frightened in a vast, unfriendly world. The lovely house by the seaside had to be sold immediately, and the little boy, carrying nothing but a small suitcase containing a pair of pajamas and a toothbrush, was sent away to live with his two aunts. Their names were Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker. And I am sorry to say, they were both really horrible people. They were selfish and lazy and cruel, and right from the beginning, they started beating poor James for almost no reason at all. They never called him by his real name, but always referred to him as "you disgusting little beast," or "you filthy nuisance," or "you miserable creature." And they certainly never gave him any toys to play with or any picture books to look at. His room was as bare as a prison cell. They lived, Aunt Sponge, Aunt Spiker, and now James as well, in a queer ramshackle house on top of a high hill in south of England. The hill was so high that from almost anywhere in the garden James could look down and see for miles and miles across the marvelous landscape of woods and fields. And on a very clear day, if he looked in the right direction, he could see a tiny gray dot far away on the horizon, which was the house that he used to live in with his beloved mother and father. And just beyond that, he could see the ocean itself, a long, thin streak of blackish blue, like a line of ink beneath the rim of the sky. But James was never allowed to go down off the top of that hill. Neither Aunt Sponge nor Aunt Spiker could ever be bothered to take him out herself, not even for a small walk or picnic, and he certainly wasn't permitted to go alone. "The nasty little beast will only get into mischief if he goes down and out of the garden," Aunt Spiker had said. And terrible punishments were promised for him, such as being locked up in the cellar with the rats for a week, if he even so much as dared to climb over the fence. The garden, which covered the whole top of the hill, was large and desolate, and the only tree in the entire place, apart from a clump of dirty old laurel bushes at the far end, was an ancient peach tree that never gave any peaches. There was no swing, no seesaw, no sandpit, and no other children were ever invited to come up the hill to play with poor James. There wasn't so much as a dog or a cat around to keep him company. And as time went on, he became sadder and sadder, and more lonely. And he used to spend hours every day standing at the bottom of the garden, gazing wistfully at the lovely but forbidden world of woods and fields and oceans that was spread out below him like a magic carpet. It's the end of chapter 1. Chapter 2. After James Henry Trotter had been living with his aunts for 3 whole years, there came a morning when something rather peculiar happened to him. And this thing, which, as I say, was only rather peculiar, soon caused a second thing to happen, which was very peculiar. And then the very peculiar thing, in its own turn, caused a really fantastically peculiar thing to occur. It all started on a blazing hot day in the middle of summer. Aunt Sponge, Aunt Spiker, and James were all out in the garden. James had been put to work as usual. This time he was chopping wood for the kitchen stove. Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker were sitting comfortably in deck chairs nearby, sipping tall glasses of fizzy lemonade and watching him to see that he didn't stop work for one moment. Aunt Sponge was enormously fat and very short. She had small piggy eyes, a sunken mouth, and one of those white, flabby faces that looked exactly as though it had been boiled. Sorry, guys. Keep skipping ahead on me. She was like a great, white, soggy, overboiled cabbage. Aunt Spiker, on the other hand, was lean and tall and bony, and she wore steel-rimmed spectacles that fixed onto the end of her nose with a clip. She had a screeching voice and long, wet, narrow lips, and whenever she got angry or excited, little flecks of spit would come shooting out of her mouth as she talked. And there they sat, these two ghastly hags, sipping their drinks and every now and again screaming at James to chop faster and faster. They also talked about themselves, each one saying how beautiful she thought she was. Aunt Sponge had a long-handled mirror in her lap, and she kept picking it up and gazing at her own hideous face. "I look and smell," Aunt Sponge declared, "as lovely as a rose. Just feast your eyes on my face. Observe my shapely nose. Behold my heavenly silky locks. And if I take off both my socks, you'll see my dainty toes. But don't forget," Aunt Spiker cried, "how much your tummy shows." Aunt Sponge went red. Aunt Spiker said, "My sweet, you cannot win. Behold my gorgeous curvy shape, my teeth, my charming grin. Oh, beauteous me, how I adore my radiant looks. And please ignore the pimple on my chin." "My dear old trout," Aunt Sponge cried out, "you're only bones and skin. Such loveliness as I possess can only truly shine in Hollywood," Aunt Sponge declared. "Oh, wouldn't that be fine? I'd capture all the nation's hearts. They'd give me all the leading parts. The stars would all resign." "I think you'd make," Aunt Spiker said, "a lovely Frankenstein." Poor James was still slaving away at the chopping block. The heat was terrible. He was sweating all over. His arm was aching. The chopper was a large, blunt thing, far too heavy for a small boy to use. And as he worked, James began thinking about all the other children in the world and what they might be doing at this moment. Some would be riding tricycles in their gardens. Some would be walking in cool woods and picking bunches of wildflowers. And all the little friends whom he used to know would be down by the seaside, playing in the wet sand and splashing around in the water. Great tears began oozing out of James's eyes and rolling down his cheeks. He stopped working and leaned against the chopping block, overwhelmed by his own unhappiness. "What's the matter with you?" Aunt Spiker screeched, glaring at him over the top of her steel spectacles. James began to cry. "Stop that immediately and get on with your work, you nasty little beast," Aunt Sponge ordered. "Oh, Auntie Sponge," James cried out, "and Auntie Spiker, couldn't we all please, just for once, go down to the seaside on the bus? It isn't very far, and I feel so hot and awful and lonely." "Why, you lazy little good-for-nothing brutes!" Aunt Spiker shouted. "Beat him!" cried Aunt Sponge. "I certainly will!" Aunt Spiker snapped. She glared at James, and James looked back at her with large, frightened eyes. "I shall beat you later on in the day when I don't feel so hot," she said. "And now get out of my sight, you disgusting little worm, and give me some peace." James turned and ran. He ran off as fast as he could into the far end of the garden and hid himself behind that clump of dirty old laurel bushes that we mentioned earlier on, and then he covered his face with his hands and began to cry and cry. So that's where we're going to stop, and now we have a quick assignment. So in class, we are talking about narrators and characters. And we know that a narrator is the person who is telling the story. But a lot of times the narrator isn't actually in the story. They're just seeing it and telling us about it. It's the same with James and the Giant Peach. So we have a narrator, and then we've been introduced to 3 characters: James, Aunt Spike, and Aunt Sponge. So your first work on writing assignment for Matilda is to write an informational or an opinion paragraph about what you think the narrator thinks about Mr. and Mrs. Wormwood. So, for practice, before you actually do your work on writing, your listen to reading assignment is to write an informational or an opinion paragraph about what you think the narrator thinks of Aunt Sponge and Auntie Spiker. So I'm going to go ahead and start a quick example one for you. So we'll go to a new document. So as it loads, we'll think about some of the things that the narrator said. So when you're writing in your journal, you need to start with the title. I'm going to title mine, "What the..." And I need to underline my title. Then I need to go down, give it a byline. So if I'm writing an informational paragraph or an opinion paragraph, I need to start with my opinion. I'm going to stick to an opinion paragraph. So I'm going to write my opinion first. I think, oh man, I'm going to use an interrupter like we learned. In my opinion, it's not like Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker and James. So, my opinion sentence in my Oreo or opinion paragraph is, in my opinion, I think that the narrator does not like Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker. Now I need to give reasons. I think this because the narrator does not describe the ants nicely in the story. So I've got my opinion. That's that the narrator does not like Ant Sponge and Ant Spiker and James and the Giant Peach. And then I've got my reasons. Why do I think that? Because the narrator doesn't describe them too nicely. Now I need to find at least 3 examples or reasons in the story itself. So let's go back to the story. And I'm looking for times where the narrator said mean things about Ant Sponge and Ant Spiker. Okay, so, and now, oh, here we go, right here. I went to live with his 2 aunts. Their names were Ant Sponge and Ant Spiker, and I am sorry to say they were both really horrible people. They were selfish and lazy and cruel right from the beginning. So, going back, he said on page 1 that they were both really horrible people. So, that's one example from the book. Let's look back. Oh, on the same page, it says that they were selfish and lazy and cruel. Those are not nice things, so I'm going to add that. He also said that they were selfish and lazy and cruel. Then I need to find one more example. So I'm going to go forward and keep reading. I remember that he said something about them looking ugly. So I'm going to go through and try and find that. Oh, Aunt Sponge was enormously fat and short. She had pig eyes and one of those white flabby faces that looked like it had been boiled. Aunt Spiker, on the other hand, was lean and tall and bony, and she wore steel-rimmed spectacles, and she had a screeching voice. He said that Aunt Sponge was fat and Aunt Spiker had a horrible screeching voice. Now, I've got my 3 reasons. He said that they were selfish and lazy and cruel. He said that they were both horrible people and that he described them as fat and having a horrible screeching voice. That tells us that the narrator does not like Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker. So now I just need to rewrite my opinion sentence. So I'm going to rewrite, in my opinion, I think that the narrator does not like Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker. And I've got my paragraph written. Now, it's your job to write your own informational or opinion paragraph about what the narrator thinks about Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker. Your opinion might be different than mine, and that's okay, and your paragraph should be different than mine. If you'd like, you can copy my paragraph as practice for a 3 in your Listen to Reading Center, or if you would like a 4, you can write your own paragraph using your own evidence from the text, which, by the way, you can get back to by rewinding this video to look back at what I said. I hope that you enjoyed this story today, and I look forward to reading your paragraph during our conference. Enjoy the rest of your day.